Maybe tonight he will come back to me.
Take it.
What is this?
On their 10th anniversary, the wife lit the candles, straightened her dress, and prayed the man she married would walk through the door like he used to. Instead, the husband dropped a bag on the table and said, "Take it." Her hands trembled. "What is this?" she whispered. He looked at her with a coldness she had never seen before. In that quiet room, where love was supposed to be remembered, one sentence was about to tear everything apart, and nothing after that night would be what it seemed. Hello, beautiful people, welcome back. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe and leave a like. It means everything to us. Please share this video with someone you care about and switch on post notifications so you won't miss any future videos. Also, comment where you're watching from. Thank you for always supporting. Now, relax and let's begin. Maureen Vaughn moved through her home with the quiet grace of a woman who had taught herself how to survive disappointment without letting it stain her dignity. Every morning, she arranged the breakfast tray carefully, folded Rodney's handkerchief the way he liked, and asked about his day with a softness that no longer received the warmth it once did. At company gatherings, she stood beside him in elegant but simple dresses, smiling gently while others praised Rodney's brilliance. He had become a man people noticed easily. Maureen, by contrast, had become someone they barely looked at, as though silence made her invisible. Yet there was nothing empty about her quietness. Her silence carried memory, discipline, and a patience forged through years of love. That evening, while Rodney took a business call and barely glanced at her, Maureen opened a small box containing old anniversary notes he had once written in his younger handwriting. "To my peace," one card said. Her fingers lingered on the words, and her eyes shone with a sadness she kept hidden even from herself. Their 10th anniversary was only days away. As she placed the card back inside, she whispered, "Maybe this year you will remember us again," then straightened her shoulders before Rodney returned. There had been a time when Rodney Cole spoke to Maureen as though she were the safest place on earth. In those early years, they lived in a narrow apartment with thin walls, a leaking tap, and a window that refused to shut properly during the rainy season. Yet Maureen remembered those days with an ache so tender it almost felt like gratitude. They laughed more then. They ate simple meals and shared dreams over tea in chipped mugs. Rodney used to hold her hand and say, "One day I'll give you everything, Maureen, just stay with me." And she always answered, "I'm already where I want to be." Nights when job rejections came one after another, Rodney would sit on the edge of their bed with his head bowed, and Maureen would kneel before him, take his trembling hands and steady his breathing. "You are not failing," she would tell him. "You are becoming." Once, when he cried from exhaustion and shame, he rested his forehead in her lap and whispered, "Don't let success ever change me." She smiled through her own tears and stroked his hair. "Then don't forget these nights," she said. The man who had spoken those words had loved deeply, honestly, and without performance. That was the man Maureen still grieved. Maureen had never been the kind of wife who announced her sacrifices like they were debts to be repaid. She simply did what love required and let the days carry the story quietly. When Rodney wanted to enroll in a professional program they could barely afford, Maureen sold the gold bracelet her father had given her on her 21st birthday. She told Rodney she had found a way to adjust things, and he kissed her forehead, never asking how. When his shoes began to wear out before an important interview, she skipped buying groceries from the larger market and stretched what they had, smiling when he admired his polished new pair. There were also the hidden sacrifices Rodney never even knew existed. A phone call Maureen made to an old family advisor. A letter of recommendation routed discreetly through trustees. A stalled application that suddenly moved. She never pushed him into places he did not deserve, but she quietly removed barriers when she could. "He must never feel carried," she once told an elderly legal trustee who had known her father. "Let him grow with his own pride." The old man had studied her with gentle concern and asked, "And who carries you, child?" Maureen only smiled and changed the subject. She had chosen love without witness, and for years she believed that was enough. Rodney's next promotion came with a corner office, a sharper wardrobe, and a different tone in his voice. It did not happen all at once, which perhaps made it harder for Maureen to resist. The change entered their marriage in small, polished ways. He began correcting her at dinner parties with a smile too smooth to be called rude. "That's not exactly how these things work, Maureen," he would say, while guests pretended not to notice. If she spoke warmly to junior staff, he later told her she was too familiar. If she wore something simple, he said she needed refinement. If she dressed more elegantly, he asked who she was trying to impress. Maureen noticed each shift, but she answered with restraint because she kept hoping the old tenderness would return if she was patient enough. One evening, as she adjusted the collar of his shirt before an event, Rodney stepped back and said, "Please, let the stylist handle this. These circles are different now." The sentence was soft, but it landed heavily. Maureen's hand paused midair, and for a second she looked more wounded than she intended. "Different from what?" she asked quietly. Rodney reached for his watch and avoided her eyes. "From before." He left the room before she could ask what before meant, and Maureen stood alone, feeling the distance widen. The company Rodney worked for had long fascinated people in business circles because its real center of power seemed strangely out of sight. The public faces changed, the executives came and went, but the institution remained steady, protected, and always 3 steps ahead. Employees spoke of the boss with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Some said the founder was an elderly woman who preferred privacy. Others said the company was controlled through trusts and layered holdings so complex that only the board fully understood them. Rodney loved the mystery. It made the company feel bigger than ordinary workplaces, almost royal in structure. To Rodney, that invisible authority became part of the thrill of rising. He enjoyed the idea of moving closer and closer to power, as though each promotion was not just a career advancement but a crossing into another class of people. "This company is different," he told Maureen one evening while loosening his tie. "You can feel it. There's real influence behind it." Maureen, seated with a book on her lap, looked at him steadily. "Influence is not always where people think it is," she said. Rodney laughed lightly, assuming she was speaking in abstractions. "That sounds poetic," he replied. He never noticed how still her face became after he said it. Rebecca George entered Rodney's world in a room full of polished laughter, expensive perfume, and corporate politeness. She was the kind of woman people turned to look at twice, not only because she was beautiful, but because she carried herself as though rooms naturally belonged to her. Her voice was smooth, her smile practiced, her eyes always measuring. At that event, Rodney had been speaking with a cluster of executives when Rebecca joined the conversation and fixed him with a bright, curious look. "So you're Rodney Cole," she said. "I've heard you're one of the company's rising stars." Rodney straightened almost unconsciously under her attention. Rebecca understood ambition the way some people understand music. She could hear it beneath a man's words, sense it in the pauses between his sentences, and play to it with precision. She did not ask Rodney about his wife or his values. She asked about his goals, his future, the scale of his vision. "You don't seem like a man built for small things," she told him that night. The compliment stayed with him long after the music ended. When he returned home, Maureen asked gently, "How was the event?" Rodney gave a distracted smile and said, "Good, productive." But while he spoke, his mind was still echoing with Rebecca's voice. A week later, Rodney attended a formal company dinner with Maureen on his arm and Rebecca seated only 2 places away. The room glowed with warm lighting and polished silverware, yet Maureen felt a quiet chill from the start. Rebecca greeted her with sweet precision. "You look very comfortable," she said, her smile bright enough to pass for kindness. Maureen understood the remark immediately and answered gently, "Comfort is not always a weakness." Rebecca lifted her glass, amused. Rodney, instead of defending his wife, leaned toward Maureen later and murmured, "Please don't be difficult. These are important people." The pain of that evening sat not in loud insults but in small betrayals. When Maureen gave a thoughtful opinion during dinner, Rodney interrupted with a soft laugh. "Maureen doesn't really follow these kinds of discussions," he said. The table smiled politely. Maureen's fingers tightened around her napkin beneath the tablecloth, but her face remained composed. Across the room, Curtis Hale noticed everything. He watched Maureen lower her eyes, not out of shame, but to protect herself from the indignity of reacting publicly. When Rodney walked away to take a call, Curtis approached her quietly and asked, "Are you all right, Mrs. Cole?" Maureen answered with a faint smile. "I'm learning to be." His interest in Rodney deepened not because she loved him, but because she believed he stood near something valuable. She had grown up around careful conversations, social calculations, and the kind of polished ambition that treated marriage like strategy dressed in silk. To her, Rodney was appealing because he was rising, admired, and eager enough to be guided. Over lunch one afternoon, she stirred her drink and said, "You know, some people spend their whole lives loyal to comfort when they should be building legacy." Rodney looked at her and asked, "And what if comfort is all they know?" Rebecca smiled. "Then someone stronger has to choose differently." What Rebecca did not know was that her understanding of power was incomplete. She had heard whispers from her mother, seen fragments of old business associations, and assumed the company's hidden seat of control was tied to people in her own circle. She believed she understood the structure because she knew the names often repeated in wealthy rooms. Maureen's name was never among them. That absence made Rebecca dismiss her entirely. "Your wife seems gentle," Rebecca told Rodney in a later conversation, "but she does not look like a woman built for the world that's opening to you." Rodney did not answer immediately, but the silence itself was already an answer, and Rebecca recognized it. At home, the changes grew easier to see and harder to excuse. Rodney now came in later than usual, carrying the scent of long meetings and unfamiliar perfume that clung lightly to his jacket. He still greeted Maureen, but his warmth had thinned into habit. He smiled more at his phone than at her. Sometimes she watched him from the kitchen doorway as he typed quickly, then locked the screen when he noticed her. "Everything all right?" she would ask. "Just work," he always replied. Yet there was a brightness in his face that never followed him into their conversations anymore. The loneliness of that season settled into ordinary things. Maureen waited by dinners that grew cold. She folded Rodney's shirts while wondering why the distance in their marriage felt louder than any argument. One night she placed his meal before him and said softly, "You have not really spoken to me all week." Rodney barely looked up. "I'm tired, Maureen. Not everything is a crisis." She stood there for a moment, absorbing the ease with which he dismissed her. Later, as she cleared the untouched second plate from the table, she saw him smiling faintly at a message on his phone. That smile, once hers to receive, hurt more than anger ever could. Claudia George met Rodney over a carefully arranged dinner at an upscale restaurant where every detail, from the flowers to the candlelight, suggested quiet evaluation. She was a graceful woman with polished manners and eyes that missed very little. Rebecca spoke of Rodney's achievements with flattering certainty, and Claudia listened with the composed interest of someone inspecting a potential investment. "Ambition is useful," she said after dessert, folding her napkin. "A man who knows how to rise can be valuable. The question is whether he knows what to leave behind." Rodney understood her meaning even before Rebecca glanced at him over her glass. Claudia did not ask whether Rodney was still married because she already knew. To her, Maureen existed only as a lingering inconvenience, someone too quiet to matter in the larger movement of things. "A man in your position must think carefully about optics," she told him. "Partnership is more than affection. It shapes perception." Rodney nodded slowly, hearing not a warning but an invitation. When he later walked Rebecca to her car, she touched his sleeve and said with a knowing smile, "My mother only gives that tone to people she considers worth serious thought." Rodney felt flattered, chosen, and strangely taller. Step by step, betrayal was beginning to sound like progress. As their 10th anniversary drew near, Maureen allowed herself a soft, fragile hope she had no real reason to trust. She took out the navy dress Rodney had once admired years earlier and held it against herself in the mirror. "You look lovely in that one," he had told her then, smiling with real warmth. The memory alone nearly undid her. She arranged a small dinner at home instead of something public, telling herself that perhaps privacy might awaken the old tenderness between them. She even gathered a few keepsakes from their early years, a note, a photograph, a receipt from their first cheap celebration, as though memory itself could become a bridge. That week, she moved through the house with careful effort, rehearsing a quiet courage. She did not plan to accuse Rodney or plead with him. She only wanted one evening in which they might speak honestly without performance or social masks. When she mentioned the anniversary over breakfast, Rodney nodded absently and said, "Yes, I remember." Maureen looked at him with a small, hopeful smile. "I thought we could keep it simple, just us." Rodney reached for his phone before answering. "Fine," he said. The word was flat, but Maureen still held on to it. Sometimes a hopeful heart can make even indifference sound like a promise. Long before Rodney entered her life, Maureen had been shaped by the quiet discipline of her father, George Vaughan. He was a man of substantial influence, but he disliked noisy power and taught his daughter that the strongest hands often moved unseen. Never confuse display with control, he used to tell her during their evening walks through the gardens of their family estate. The loudest person in a room is rarely the one holding it together. George raised Maureen not to chase attention, but to understand responsibility. When she was still young, he began preparing structures that would one day protect both the company and his daughter from opportunists. After George's passing, Maureen inherited far more than wealth. She inherited trusts, board authority, legal responsibilities, and the weight of a legacy people were not supposed to trace easily. The advisors around her encouraged privacy, caution, and deliberate distance. When she later married Rodney, she made one deeply personal decision. She would not build her home around her name or influence. "I want one place where I am just Maureen," she told Curtis during a quiet meeting years earlier. He had watched her thoughtfully and said, "That is a beautiful wish, but not always a safe one." Maureen smiled then. "Perhaps love can make it safe," she replied. There were moments in Rodney's rise that he later remembered as fortunate turns, though none of them felt suspicious at the time. A training opportunity that reopened after being full. A senior mentor who suddenly took interest in his potential. A difficult recommendation that somehow moved faster than expected. Rodney accepted each breakthrough as proof of his growing brilliance. Maureen never corrected him. She only listened when he came home excited, speaking of progress with bright, grateful pride. "I think things are finally opening for me," he once said, pulling her into a quick embrace. Maureen smiled into his shoulder and whispered, "I'm glad." Some of those openings were quiet interventions, never dishonest, never forced, only carefully permitted through old networks loyal to George Vaughan's memory. Maureen had insisted on that balance. "He must stand on his own merit," she told the trustees. "Just don't let needless barriers crush him before he begins." Curtis respected her for that. He saw how sincerely she wanted Rodney's dignity protected, even when it meant her own role remained unseen. Years later, while Rodney boasted about how completely self-made he had become, Maureen would sometimes look at him and feel not pride alone, but sorrow too. Love had helped build him, yet he had begun to mistake support for his own reflection. What began between Rodney and Rebecca as flattering conversation soon turned into something far less innocent. Their meetings became frequent, then private, then wrapped in the kind of secrecy that pretends not to be what it is. Rebecca liked making Rodney feel exceptional. Rodney liked the version of himself he became under her admiring gaze. One evening after a company function, they lingered in the quiet lounge of a hotel long after others had left. "Do you ever feel," Rebecca asked, tracing the rim of her glass, "that you are living below the life meant for you?" Rodney looked at her, held by the question more than the words. He should have gone home then. Instead, he stayed. That choice, though small in movement, changed something lasting inside him. After that evening, he began speaking of his marriage not as a sacred bond under strain, but as an old arrangement standing in the way of a more elevated future. Rebecca encouraged the shift with patient strategy. "You are loyal to history," she told him one afternoon, "when you should be loyal to destiny." Rodney repeated those words to himself often. By then, his betrayal was no longer confusion or weakness. It had become intention. He was not drifting from Maureen anymore. He was walking away while telling himself it was growth. For days, Maureen carried one painful question inside her like a stone she could neither swallow nor set down. She wanted to ask Rodney whether there was someone else, but the fear of hearing the truth held her back. Instead, one quiet evening, she found him in the living room adjusting his cufflinks for yet another late engagement and asked something smaller, gentler, yet far more vulnerable. "Rodney," she said softly, "are you still happy with me?" The question hung between them with a tenderness that made it difficult to escape honestly. Rodney glanced at her, then at his reflection in the mirror and exhaled as though burdened. "What kind of question is that?" He asked, not angrily but with a distance that made the answer feel worse. Maureen clasped her hands together. "A truthful one." Rodney reached for his jacket and replied, "I don't have energy for this tonight." She tried once more, her voice thinner now. "Please, I only want to understand whether we are still standing in the same marriage." He gave a short, tired smile that carried no kindness. "You always make things heavier than they need to be." After he left, Maureen remained seated in the darkened room for a long time, realizing that silence had finally become more frightening than answers. By the time wedding dresses began appearing in Rebecca's imagination, Rodney had not yet formally ended his marriage. That did not stop her from picturing the life ahead with stunning confidence. She discussed venues, guest lists, executive hosting, and social positioning with the ease of someone who believed the future had already bowed to her. "Once this is settled, everything changes," she told her closest friend during a private fitting. "The right marriage opens doors that ordinary women spend years knocking on." She spoke of Maureen not with hatred, but with dismissal, as though Rodney's wife had already faded into something irrelevant and outgrown. Rebecca's fantasies extended far beyond romance. She imagined access to company privileges, invitations to exclusive spaces, and the subtle authority that came from being linked to a man she believed stood close to the hidden center of wealth. She studied which wives hosted important dinners, which names carried influence, and how a woman could step into power simply by being placed beside the right man. "Rodney is not just successful," she told her mother. "He is near something much bigger." Claudia said little, but her silence carried approval. Neither woman understood that they were building plans on a false map. The empire Rebecca imagined inheriting did not sit where she thought it did. Curtis Hale had spent enough years around power to recognize the quiet signs of danger before others noticed them. He saw the change in Rodney's posture, the reckless brightness in Rebecca's confidence, and the painful restraint in Maureen's eyes. He also heard things, unfinished comments in hallways, bold assumptions made too loudly, careless references to future authority that no one had granted. At first, Curtis said nothing. He believed people often exposed themselves more fully when they felt unobserved. But as the whispers grew less careful, so did his concern. What had begun as private betrayal was drifting dangerously close to corporate misuse. One afternoon, Curtis visited Maureen under the respectful pretense of a routine legal update. She welcomed him into her sitting room, where sunlight touched the edges of framed photographs she rarely displayed to others. Curtis studied her face and asked quietly, "How much do you know?" Maureen looked down at her untouched tea. "Enough to lose sleep," she answered. He hesitated before speaking again. "This is beginning to touch your father's structures. It may not remain private much longer." Maureen closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them with calm sadness. "I never wanted truth to arrive through pain," she said. Curtis nodded. "Truth often arrives that way when pride blocks gentler doors." The evening of their 10th anniversary came wrapped in soft light and aching expectation. Maureen dressed slowly, smoothing the navy fabric over her body with trembling hands, then arranged the dining table with candles, fresh flowers, and the careful grace of someone trying to honor a marriage even while sensing its breath had grown faint. She placed the old keepsakes in a small box near her chair, planning to show Rodney only if the moment softened enough to allow it. As the hours passed, the food cooled, the candles shortened, and the house grew too quiet. Still, she waited. Hope, even wounded hope, often lingers past reason. When Rodney finally arrived, it was late enough for the room to feel hollow. He did not apologize for the delay. In one hand he carried a sleek designer bag, and in his face there was none of the gentleness Maureen had prayed might return. She stood slowly, forcing a small smile. "You made it," she said. Rodney's gaze moved over the table, the flowers, the dress she wore, and for a brief second something unreadable passed through his eyes. Then it vanished. Without sitting down, he walked to the table and placed the bag on it. The sound of it landing broke the room's fragile warmth, and Maureen's heart tightened before a word was spoken. Rodney unzipped the bag with mechanical calm and turned it toward Maureen. Inside, stacks of cash sat arranged with almost deliberate neatness, as though cruelty became easier when presented cleanly. Maureen stared at the money, not understanding at first what kind of anniversary gesture this could possibly be. Her voice, when it came, was soft and confused. "What is this?" Rodney straightened and answered without warmth, "Settlement." The single word emptied the air from the room. Maureen looked from the cash to his face, searching for some trace of the man who once trembled at the thought of losing her. "Settlement for what?" she whispered. Rodney's jaw tightened, but not from sadness. "I want a divorce, Maureen." The sentence landed with such cold finality that even the candle flame seemed to shrink. Maureen gripped the back of her chair to keep herself steady. "Tonight?" she asked. "On our anniversary." Rodney gave a dismissive shrug meant to pass as practicality. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be. I've outgrown this marriage." Tears rose to Maureen's eyes, but she refused to let them fall before him. "And who are you marrying?" she asked. Rodney hesitated just long enough to enjoy the wound he was opening. "Someone who fits where I'm going," he said. For a long moment after Rodney's words settled, Maureen could hear nothing except the quiet hum of the air conditioning and the frantic beat of her own heart. She did not scream, though part of her wanted to. She did not beg, though pain pressed at her chest with almost unbearable force. Instead, she looked at the man before her with the grief of someone watching a familiar face vanish behind a stranger's expression. "When did you stop being my husband?" she asked. The question was so gentle, so sorrowful, that Rodney's eyes flickered for the first time that night. But pride stood beside him and answered in his place. He placed the divorce papers on the table beside the bag and said, "Read them when you're calmer." Then he turned and walked away before he had to witness what he had broken. The front door closed softly, yet the sound echoed through the house like something larger ending. Only then did Maureen's control finally collapse. She sank into her chair, pressed both hands over her mouth, and wept with the helplessness of a woman whose memories had just been humiliated in her own home. The anniversary dress, the candles, the old love notes, the untouched meal, everything around her became part of the same ache. 10 years had not ended loudly. They had ended with a bag. The next morning, Curtis came to see Maureen not as a director, but as a loyal guardian of a legacy he knew was now in danger. He found her in the sunroom, pale but composed, with the divorce papers stacked neatly beside her untouched tea. For a while they said nothing. Then Curtis spoke gently. "Rebecca has made assumptions she should never have made. She believes the company's private ownership rests somewhere near her family's old social ties." Maureen gave a sad, almost tired smile. "She has mistaken proximity for control," she said. Curtis nodded. "And Rodney has mistaken access for achievement," leaned back and closed her eyes briefly. "I never wanted any of this to come out through scandal," she admitted. "I wanted my marriage to survive as something separate from the world my father left me." Curtis studied her with deep respect. "You gave that marriage sincerity. Others did not." She opened her eyes again, this time steadier. "I do not want revenge, Curtis," he answered carefully. "This is no longer only about revenge or hurt. It is reaching legal lines. Promises are being made in your company's name." Maureen lowered her gaze to the papers Rodney had left. "Then truth may have to stand where love failed," she said quietly. Rodney moved forward with startling speed, as though haste itself could prove he had made the right choice. He attended venue visits, tastings, and fittings with Rebecca, telling himself that the rush meant certainty rather than escape. Rebecca glowed beside him, delighted by every decision. She discussed flowers with authority, seeding plans with confidence, and post-marriage life with the kind of assurance that made Rodney feel he was stepping upward into something grander. "You seem lighter already," she told him one afternoon, while adjusting a cufflink she had chosen for him. Rodney smiled and answered, "Maybe I finally stopped pretending." Beneath those polished public smiles, something unsettled continued to move quietly. Curtis attended some company functions with a face more serious than usual. Certain board members who once greeted Rodney warmly had become reserved. Rodney noticed, but Rebecca brushed it aside. "People react when they sense change," she said with a dismissive wave. "They'll adjust when they see where you belong." He wanted to believe her. Meanwhile, Maureen remained absent from their discussions in a way that only increased Rebecca's confidence. "She took the settlement," Rebecca said one evening, satisfied. "That tells you everything." Rodney said nothing. Somewhere beneath his pride, a discomfort he refused to name had begun to grow. When the legal meeting came, Maureen arrived dressed simply, her expression calm enough to make Rodney think she had accepted defeat. The lawyer reviewed the terms carefully, and Rodney kept his eyes mostly on the documents, avoiding the weight of her silence. Maureen listened without interruption, asked two precise questions, then signed where required with a steady hand. There was no scene, no pleading, no visible anger. That composure unnerved Rodney more than tears might have. "You're taking this better than I expected," he said at last, attempting lightness. Maureen looked at him and answered, "You never understood what I could survive." However, Maureen was not untouched. She was grieving quietly, not for the lifestyle attached to the marriage, but for the version of Rodney she had once built her future around. That evening, after the meeting, she stood before the window in her bedroom and let herself feel the sorrow without resisting it. "I did not fail because I loved deeply," she whispered to the empty room. "I only failed by hopping too long." Curtis later called to check on her, and when he asked whether she regretted signing, Maureen answered with aching clarity, "No, I regret that he made truth necessary." She was not plotting. She was simply stepping aside and letting reality approach. Rebecca's confidence eventually led her into carelessness. She began speaking too freely to planners, social contacts, and even one or two junior staff members about what would change after the wedding. She hinted at executive privileges, described future access to restricted properties, and referred to upcoming restructuring as though she had already stepped into authority. Most people nodded politely without understanding the full weight of what she implied. But in institutions built on careful silence, even loose remarks travel far. It did not take long for fragments of her assumptions to reach bored ears that knew exactly how little power she actually possessed. When Curtis received the first formal note regarding those remarks, he knew the situation had crossed from painful to dangerous. He called an urgent meeting with a small circle of trusted legal advisors, and together they reviewed messages, overheard conversations, and documented assumptions linked to the wedding. "This can no longer remain a private family matter," one advisor said gravely. Curtis agreed. "The moment company authority is being invoked through false expectation, we have an obligation to act." That evening, he visited Maureen again and laid the facts before her gently. She listened without interruption, then asked only one question. "If I remain silent now, what follows?" Curtis answered honestly, "A greater lie." The wedding invitation arrived at Maureen's house in cream paper and gold script, formal and beautiful in a way that almost mocked the wound beneath it. She held it for several seconds before opening it, reading her husband's name beside Rebecca, with a stillness so controlled it seemed carved from pain. Curtis sat across from her in silence, giving her room to breathe. At last, Maureen placed the card on the table and said, "I should not have to enter that room." Curtis answered softly, "No, but truth may have to." She looked toward the window where late afternoon light rested on the glass and whispered, "Then I will go." Her decision was not born from bitterness. If anything, it came from the last remains of dignity she refused to surrender. She would not arrive to accuse, plead, or disrupt. She would arrive because falsehood had begun building a future on her silence. Over the next days, Curtis and the board prepared carefully, ensuring every document, structure, and legal instrument that might be needed was in place. Maureen, meanwhile, chose her clothes with measured simplicity. "Not too grand," she told her attendant. "I am not going there to shine. I am going there to stand." Even in heartbreak, she remained herself gentle, composed, and stronger than those who mistook softness for surrender. Rodney woke on the morning of the wedding with the nervous energy of a man convinced he was stepping into a brighter life. The suite around him was elegant, the schedule precise, the calls from groomsmen cheerful and admiring. He looked in the mirror while adjusting his tie and told himself the unease beneath his ribs was ordinary wedding tension. After today, everything changes, he murmured, trying the sentence like reassurance. Across town, Rebecca sat before a panel of mirrors while stylists arranged her hair and dress. She smiled at her reflection like a woman greeting her own future. "This is the day everything opens," she told Claudia. Yet beneath the carefully managed beauty of the morning, small disturbances began to gather. Rodney noticed that one senior executive who was meant to greet him seemed distracted and formal. Rebecca heard that Curtis had arrived early and did not like the detail. Claudia, ever observant, sensed a tension in certain guests that did not match celebration. "Something feels unusual," she murmured while watching arrivals through a side window. Rebecca dismissed it instantly. "People are curious, that's all." But even she could not ignore the appearance of a few older board members who rarely attended society weddings. They entered not like guests, but like people arriving for something far more serious than a ceremony. When Rebecca stepped into the bridal suite in her finished gown, she looked every bit like the woman she had imagined becoming. The silk fitted her beautifully, the veil softened her features, and her smile held the glow of complete certainty. She believed Maureen had faded into the background exactly where women like Maureen were supposed to remain after being left behind. To Rebecca, this was not only a wedding. It was confirmation that she had chosen correctly, climbed correctly, and aligned herself with a future large enough to satisfy her hunger for status. "By tonight," she told her friend with a laugh, "my life will belong to a different level." Her confidence deepened as the hall filled with influential faces. Each guest looked, in her mind, like another witness to her success. She saw Rodney at the altar and admired how proud he appeared. She also noticed the absent space where Maureen should have been if heartbreak had made her reckless enough to attend. "She is gone," Rebecca whispered to herself, pleased. Claudia adjusted Rebecca's veil and said in a lower voice, "Stay composed. Rooms like this remember everything." Rebecca smiled. "Let them remember." She had no idea the room was indeed about to remember something unforgettable, only not the story she thought she was writing. The first shift in the room was almost too subtle to name. Conversation softened. Heads turned toward the entrance. Then a stillness spread so quickly that even the musicians faltered before recovering. Maureen had arrived. She was dressed in quiet elegance, not the kind that begged to be noticed, but the kind that made attention unavoidable. Her posture was calm, her expression controlled, and though there was sadness in her eyes, there was nothing defeated in the way she moved. Rodney, seeing her, felt confusion before fear. Rebecca, from where she stood, frowned in irritation. Claudia, however, went very still. Then something happened that broke the room's balance entirely. Board members began to rise. Senior executives straightened at once. Curtis stepped forward, not with surprise but with formal respect. Rodney stared, unable to understand what he was seeing. "Why are they standing?" he whispered to no one. Curtis stopped before Maureen and bowed his head slightly. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that carried through the hall, "the board is ready whenever you are." Rebecca's bouquet trembled in her hands. Rodney's face lost its color. Claudia closed her eyes briefly, as if some long-hidden suspicion had just hardened into certainty. What followed felt less like a revelation than the sudden lifting of a veil everyone but Rodney and Rebecca should perhaps have noticed sooner. Curtis addressed the gathering with grave courtesy, explaining that serious legal misunderstandings connected to company authority had made clarification unavoidable. Then documents were presented, names were spoken, and ownership structures long hidden from public view were finally laid bare. Maureen Vaughn was not a discarded, ordinary wife standing helplessly at the edge of wealth. She was the controlling authority behind the company Rodney had spent years climbing through. The room held its breath while Rodney stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. Rebecca's collapse came only seconds later. The same evidence that revealed Maureen's authority also exposed Rebecca's assumptions, messages, and private promises. Her conversations about future access, control, and privilege were read in devastating summary. It became unmistakably clear that whatever affection she had shown, Rodney was tied closely to what she believed he could give her. "You said you were near the center of everything," she hissed under her breath, panic replacing beauty. Rodney turned to her slowly, wounded and hollow. "So that's what this was." Rebecca had no gentle answer left. In less than an hour, the wedding dissolved, the illusion shattered, and Rodney's pride stood stripped before everyone. After the hall had thinned and the polished celebration had fallen into silence, Rodney found Maureen in a private corridor beyond the main reception room. For the first time in years, he looked like the younger man who once feared losing everything, only now the fear was real and deserved. His eyes were wet, his voice unsteady. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Why did you let me go this far without knowing who you were?" Maureen turned toward him slowly. The sorrow in her face held no cruelty, only final understanding. "Because I wanted one place in my life," she said softly, "where I was loved for myself." Rodney shook his head, struggling against the truth now breaking him open. "I would have done better, I would have treated you differently." Maureen's gaze did not move. "That is exactly why I could not tell you," she replied. "You would not have loved me more, you would only have pretended better." The words settled with quiet finality between them. Rodney lowered his head, and for once there was no defense left to reach for. Maureen then stepped past him, not in anger but in release. He had not traded an ordinary wife for power. He had thrown away both love and power because he failed to recognize the worth already beside him. We've come to the end of the story. Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like, share, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification. Thank you so much for watching.